So I hear this from a lot of parents. They're worried, I'm not a good storyteller, or I don't have good stories. And I want to come back to, you are a good storyteller. Human beings are storytellers. We're not talking about the big stories here. We're talking about the small stories that weave our lives together. Told in small moments and told in moments when we may need to hear certain stories or others. So one of the things that we have found in our research with lots and lots of families now, we ask adolescents, tell me a story you know about when your mom, when she was growing up, when she was about your age, or your dad, And we may ask for a very general story. We may ask for a particular kind of story, a story when she was proud of something she did, maybe even a negative story, a story when she was maybe ashamed or felt guilty about something. It turns out that well over 90% of the adolescents we've interviewed are able to tell us these stories.
I am here today with Robyn Fivush, who is a professor emeritus of psychology at Emory University. Robyn is also the author of more than 150 articles and book chapters, including her most recent book, Family Narratives and the Development of an Autobiographical Self. Robyn, I also really enjoy reading your blog posts in Psychology Today. And I know you and I talked about this previously on our intro call, but I came across your writing while I was doing some digging around in this idea that we as individuals may be unreliable narrators in our own story. And I started kind of digging around in that. And somehow that led me to you talking about family stories and family narratives, which was a much more interesting topic than the idea that I am an unreliable narrator in my own life. And I don't know if you could hear that, but that was my 16-year-old calling. Speaking of family stories, so I thought I really wanted to talk to you more about this topic, and I thought that our listeners would really enjoy hearing from you as well. And so I would love to just start by having you describe for us, when we say family stories and the importance and the role of family stories in developing identity and memory and emotional well-being and general well-being, what do you mean by family stories?
Well, first, thanks for inviting me to be on this podcast with you, and I enjoyed our previous conversation, and I'm looking forward to continuing it. So as we've already talked about, family stories are actually, there are a lot of different kinds of family stories, and they all fall under this general umbrella term. And a lot of family stories are just the everyday coming back together at the end of the day and piecing together, what happened at school, what happened at work, what happened at the grocery store, weaving ourselves back together into the family narrative of our family that continues to exist day to day. And those are just what have been called small stories, little stories, right? And that's stories, that we share together. Then there are the stories that families tell about their shared experiences in the past. And these also happen all the time. In studies that we've done where we've simply recorded family interactions, families talking over the dinner table, these kinds of stories emerge every 5 minutes where one family member, one of the parents or a sibling or a grandparent, if they happen to be, will say something like, oh, that's like the time we went to the beach last summer. Or, oh, remember how scared you were when we saw Jaws in the movie theater? So these are kinds of stories that we all have experience. We have the experience and we're reminiscing, we're sharing it together. Maybe we're savoring the moment. They can also be sad stories, and we'll come back to that. But they're shared. And then there's a special kind of story, and I think a lot of people talk about these when they talk about family stories. This is what they mean. The stories that are passed down. So it's the stories that parents tell their children about when they were growing up, or maybe grandparents tell their children. But these are stories that the teller has experienced it. I've had this experience. This is what happened to me, and I'm telling it to you. You've not yet experienced anything like this. So it might be, I remember when I went to college, I remember meeting my roommate for the first time. Or I remember when I went to my high school prom. Or I remember when I went to my first swim meet, or whatever it is.
Hmm.
It's an experience that the teller has had, but the person that we're telling the story to hasn't yet had this experience, or maybe never will have this experience. And then there's family history. These are stories that have passed out of lived experience. And this is really a lot of family genealogists are interested in these kinds of stories. So these are our, great great grandparents. And we may have letters or diaries, but it's not, as my colleague Marshall Duke says, from their lips.
Yeah.
So you can't question them. You can't query them. It's not a lived story in the same sense.
Mm-hmm.
They're still important stories. They still frame who our family is, who we are, but they're a different kind of story. The other distinction that's really important to make is a lot of people think when we talk about family stories, they think about it has to be this big, epic, iconic story. And there are those kinds of stories, and a lot of families have them, and they're great. It's a story that crazy Uncle Joe has to tell every Thanksgiving. And it's this big, funny, epic story about how he fell in love with Aunt Louise and pursued her to the ends of the earth, and she finally agreed to marry him. And
Everyone in the family can tell it because they've heard it so many times.
Everybody knows it, and everybody wants to hear it, and they want to hear it the same way. Those are important stories. They're definitely defining for a family. But most family stories are told in small moments. They're told in bits and pieces. You're chopping an onion, preparing for dinner, and, your daughter says, "Oh, yeah, I forgot to tell you, I have to bring cupcakes for a school social tomorrow." And you say, "Oh, I remember when I was a kid, I used to really love those school socials." And you tell a little story about going to a school social. Your daughter may not even listen to the whole story. You may get half of it out. But at some point, maybe a few days later, maybe the day after the social, maybe it comes up again and you finish that story. So stories are told in moments, in bits and pieces. When you're driving in the carpool, when you're dropping them off, at the soccer game.
Mm-hmm.
So stories are literally the way we understand our lives and our experiences. We tell stories all the time, small moments and big moments.
Yeah. Yeah. And when you and I were talking, and what your research really has focused on is the role that those stories play, especially for young people in terms of memory, in terms of, building one's identity and their own narrative of their own lives. And so what can you talk to specifically around that? Like, how is it that stories play these roles and why are they so important?
That's a lot of big questions.
I know. Take whichever of those you feel.
We'll start to pick it apart a little bit.
Okay.
So I sort of say this: human beings are storytellers. We've been storytellers from the time we have any kind of prehistory at all. I mean, cave paintings from Neolithic times are stories. We understand our world through stories. We tell stories. We share stories. We hear stories. And we construct our sense of who we are through storying what experiences have I had, but it goes beyond just this happened and this happened and this happened to what do those experiences mean? Why were they important? How did I think about it? How do I feel about it? And stories shift over time. So for example, you have an experience of taking a class in high school, maybe on environmental sciences, and you perfectly enjoy that class. But then you get to college and you take another class and you realize that, oh, this is a passion. This is what I want to do with my life. And suddenly you're rewriting your story where that earlier experience becomes more defining of who you are. So stories are always in flux, but they define who we are. And it's not just our own personal stories. This is why I really want to focus on the family stories. We exist in these larger social families and communities that shape our stories, our individual stories. But my family story is part of my story. Who my mother was is part of who I am, for good or ill. I mean, sometimes it's in a very positive way. Unfortunately, for some people, it may not be, but you can't escape those stories. They are the way we make sense out of the world. They're the way the world becomes coherent and consistent, and how we start to think about ourselves. That becomes really important in adolescence because in adolescence, all of us go through what the developmental psychologist Eric Erikson called the identity crisis, which is not really a crisis as much as a questioning. We get to a point in our lives where we're able to think about the future in more abstract ways. We're able to think about our place in the world, in the universe, who we want to be, what we want to do. And we start to form what's called a narrative identity.
Hmm.
So all the little stories that we know about ourselves start to cohere into, oh, these are the experiences I've had that have made me who I am and who I want to be. And it's at this point in time that these intergenerational and family stories become really critical in helping me formulate my own personal identity. But they remain important throughout life. I mean, as whenever we face life's challenges, we go to family to help understand it.
Yeah.
Both good and bad. The stories that we share as families change with new challenges, meeting a romantic partner, perhaps getting married, perhaps having a child. Both the stories that get told and how they get received, how they get listened to, change.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such an interesting idea. I tend to think of these stories as, I mean, you're describing them as living, almost like living things,
Absolutely.
and I think prior to our conversation would think about them as being a little bit more static. It's like a telling of something rather than a re-experiencing or an experiencing and then re-experiencing of, which would be more dynamic. That as I change, as I start to incorporate other things into my own growth, my development, even at my age, hearing a story, I hear that from a different place, and it is going to have different meaning to me. It's just a really interesting idea that these are not static things, and even if you tell it the same way, you as the teller, the listener may receive that in a very different way.
Exactly.
In our last conversation, Robyn, you described this idea of the identity crisis, not an actual crisis, but and that these stories become particularly powerful for teenagers. And one of the questions I asked you was like, oh gosh, okay, well, as someone who has 3 teenagers at home, how can we help our kids through this? How can we tell stories, better stories, to help them move through this time of their lives?
So I hear this from a lot of parents. They're worried. I'm not a good storyteller, or I don't have good stories. And I want to come back to, you are a good storyteller. Human beings are storytellers. We're not talking about the big stories here. We're talking about the small stories that weave our lives together, told in small moments and told in moments when we may need to hear certain stories or others. So one of the things that we have found in our research with lots and lots of families now, we ask adolescents, tell me a story you know about when your mom, when she was growing up, when she was about your age, or your dad, And we may ask for a very general story. We may ask for a particular kind of story, a story when she was proud of something she did, maybe even a negative story, a story when she was maybe ashamed or felt guilty about something. It turns out that well over 90% of the adolescents we've interviewed are able to tell us these stories. Some tell better stories than others, that is, stories that are more detailed, more elaborated. We can come back to that because that does matter.
Hmm.
But they all have stories. And the ones that don't have a lot of stories or don't have detailed stories almost always say, I wish I knew more stories.
Hmm.
But one of the things we do in our work is we get a story. Like, let's say I interviewed one of your teenage kids, and they told me maybe you were the swimming championship in high school. So now I come to you and I say, oh, your daughter told me about when you won the championship swim meet in high school. And your response almost invariably is, I can't believe she remembered that story. I didn't think she was listening.
That's right.
She was rolling her eyes, right? They do roll their eyes, but they're listening and they're hearing them. And parents are always surprised at the stories that our adolescents actually tell back to us. They are listening. They are hungry for these stories. And they may be rolling their eyes, but these stories matter to them because these stories help them. And when we ask adolescents, why do you think your mom told us this story? Why do you think your dad told us this story? To help me understand who they are as a person, to build an emotional bond. Most important reason, to help me learn about the world, to help me navigate my world. These stories come up when kids need them. You don't have to worry about it. It's a natural way of interacting. Your child comes home with a problem. They're being bullied, or the math class is just too hard. They're not getting it. Something is bothering them. The story comes out naturally, and they get it when they need it.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, because that is the answer you gave me last time, and it is so reassuring to hear a second time around even. And since we had our last conversation, I've been paying a little bit more attention. It's usually coming from my 16-year-old. I have a 16, 13, and 12, usually coming from my 16-year-old. Yeah. And I have been listening to and paying a little bit more attention to how I respond and seeing whether I'm providing a story when she comes with an issue. And she had an issue this week. And what I found myself doing is acknowledging it for her and not necessarily providing an example myself or a story from my own youth. Since our conversation, have been feeling like, okay, well, what could I insert here as a story? Naturally. I mean, I didn't do it every time we talked about it, but what could I say here that could help her? Can you talk a little bit about that really critical piece of the story that we tell in not just our experience or the action of our story, but how we processed it and resolved it for ourselves, and why that can be a really powerful element of storytelling?
It goes back to what stories do for us and why stories are. As I said earlier, stories are not just simple chronological sequences. Stories provide meaning and texture. Why did things unfold the way they did? How did that happen that way? Why did they happen that way? And they're very much not just about things in the world, but about people. Why did the relationship happen that way? Why was so-and-so angry? Or why was so-and-so unhappy about this? We understand our relationships through the stories of the experiences we've had together. And those stories change. Over time, we understand them differently. We think about them differently. And maybe we come to a different kind of understanding. So let's say we have an argument with a good friend. And at first, we're just bewildered why this friend is so angry. But because that's an important relationship, we may think about it and we may change it. We may say, well, maybe she was angry because she was having a bad day and I wasn't listening and I wasn't being a good friend. We kind of restructure the story or reframe it in a certain way. Adolescents have trouble doing that. They're not yet cognitively able to do that kind of complex perspective taking. They're coming to it, but it's hard. That's hard work. So what intergenerational stories do is provide models of how to reframe, how to think about the world, how to think about people and relationships in ways that adolescents can then model and start to understand and internalize for their own personal stories. And it helps them create their own sense of who they are. So that's why it's important when we talk about stories, the adolescents who are kind of getting the most out of these intergenerational narratives are the adolescents who talk about what their parent was thinking and feeling, not just what happened.
Are other members of a family unit able to deliver stories in this kind of intergenerational narrative in a way that is as powerful or impactful?
Yes and no.
Okay.
The big answer is yes, with some caveats.
Okay.
My research has focused on family units because that's my research interest. But this is really, intergenerational narratives are really about older generation to younger generation. Could be grandparents, could be aunts and uncles, could be teachers, mentors, members of the community, your coach, a religious leader. There anybody that you have a meaningful relationship with. But it's having a meaningful relationship makes a difference. Some stories just become iconic stories, like the American rags to riches story. It's kind of a generalized schema, work hard, get ahead. But the stories that really impact on positive youth development, leading to higher self esteem, a greater sense of mastery, a greater sense of being an active agent in the world, being able to create change in the world, having a sense of meaning and purpose. This has to be stories from somebody you identify with
Interesting.
because it's your identity.
Yeah. Yeah. My parents worked in adolescent resilience, child development for a long time. And I remember them always saying this number sticks. I don't know if the research still bears this out, but that kids need at least 3 adults in their lives that they can trust and go to. Having people beyond just your parents and other adults that you can go to where you have this kind of meaningful relationship would help provide a wider net for these kinds of
Absolutely.
stories to be meaningful.
Both for kids who unfortunately may not have the parental relationships that we might hope for, and or for kids who are growing up with aspects of their identity that their parents may not quite have stories about.
Mm-hmm.
uh, Perhaps a child with chronic illness whose parents don't share that illness. They may be very sympathetic, but they may not have the kinds of stories about coping with that kind of challenge that maybe another adult who has had to cope with that could help provide. Or, in other cases where you may have a child who has a um, different sexual identity than the parent, or a different, maybe even a transcultural adoption,
Mm-hmm.
you know, where you might have lots and lots of family stories that are really positive for you, but there are certain aspects of your identity that are not being represented in the family stories.
Yeah, we touched on that briefly last time, this idea that the community can, a wider community can help provide that. And as a parent, that feels like sort of a key takeaway for me is to, if and when possible, identify that there may be an aspect of my relationship with my own kids that I can't fulfill in that way, and helping them find someone who can could be really beneficial for them to find that other adult that they identify with. Um,
There's another side to this, and that is being a parent is stressful. Being a
what?
parent at all ages, being a parent of a teenager poses particular kinds of challenges. So parents having a community that they can share their stories with provides an environment in which parents can flourish and be better parents for it.
Yeah.
So the community is important not just for the adolescents hearing from the older generation. Community is important for the well-being of the families that
Yes.
participate in those communities.
Boy, I am sensing a next podcast idea. How do we build these communities in a very thoughtful way? Um, Robyn, you just made me think of another question, another thought. Oh, I don't know that your research has gotten to this or could point to this specifically. Maybe so, and if not, that's okay. Are teens able to identify when aspects of their identity are not perhaps being met by the adults that are currently in their lives?
I think there's no easy answer to that. There's such huge individual variability in how teenagers kind of navigate the teenage years. The extent to which they are comfortable and able to explore who they are and take chances. Part of that is, their previous early environment. Part of it is temperamental personality. Um, part of it is the social and cultural times in which you're coming of age. I think COVID is a great example of this. I think we're still seeing some of the repercussions of teenagers who were essentially socially isolated during this critical developmental period through no fault of their own. And I think for necessary reasons, for health reasons. So I'm not criticizing the decision to to isolate.
Hmm.
But particularly for teenagers, that came at a time, if you think back to your high school years, think about your first really intimate friendship, your first romance, your first kiss. How do you recover that if you spent a year or a year and a half on Zoom or
Hmm.
on social media?
Yeah.
I think it took a real toll. Again, what do we do about that? I think we talk about it. We try and share those stories. We try and help, bridge those gaps. But like any other historical moment, we have to live with the challenges that we are faced with.
That's right. The consequences of that. Is there, with a lot of aspects of child development, there are sort of these critical windows that are described. Is it the same for teens and identity development with storytelling in this way, where, as you're discussing, this kind of isolation may have an implication that is more difficult to overcome later or impossible to overcome later?
I don't think anything is impossible to overcome. Let me just say that. There are sensitive periods in development across the lifespan. I think if we're talking about something like, social isolation, the experience of that for a 3-year-old, 10-year-old, 16-year-old, a 57-year-old, very different. But those are challenges for each of those age periods. And how we meet those challenges might be similar in some ways and different in others. I think that the challenges for the teenagers were unique to that developmental period of identity development.
Yeah. Can we um, can we play catch up? Can we encourage more social, in-person
Yes,
real life activity as a way to sort of catch up on what was missed during those
yes,
periods? Yeah.
yes, I think we can. I mean, one of the things that I did in my classes is I used storytelling. One of the things that I noticed, because we spent a year online, and one of the things I noticed when we were back in person was that students would come into class and immediately get on their phone and start texting their friends and not talk to the person sitting next to them.
Oh my goodness, yes.
So we used storytelling. We used various storytelling devices in kind of small groups and, think, pair, share exercises, which teachers use all the time, you know, to kind of reintroduce them to come into a room and you sit down next to somebody and you chat with them.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yes, of course, we can
Yeah.
relearn those skills.
Relearn and safely encourage them. So we talked a little bit about this last time too. I've spoken recently to a couple of authors who are writing about the digital lives of kids and teens and kind of what that online engagement and interaction is like and the consequences of that and not having as much in real life opportunity to engage with each other. And don't know that your research again specifically addresses this, but if so, or what kind of thoughts do you have around the idea of storytelling and kind of being together in those shared digital spaces versus in real life? And I'll stop there. In real life versus in the digital world.
My research really does not speak to this in any kind of direct way. I think, like every other new technology that humans have ever invented and encountered, there are advantages and disadvantages. Um, I mean, to if we go back to the pandemic, I mean, if we didn't have Zoom and social media, it would have been way more devastating to be socially isolated. Yet at the same time, that kind of social interaction may not provide some of the critical things that in real life does.
Yeah.
Was it
Yeah.
good or bad or indifferent? The arguments that favor this is particularly for individuals who are living in smaller communities that, social media allows us to connect with people who are like us, like people who are interested in chess. And there's nobody in my neighborhood that plays chess, but I can have a community online. Is that a good thing? Maybe. You know, is it a good thing that I'm constantly online and looking for thumbs up likes? And probably not. Does social media make us more anxious? Yeah, I think there's some evidence that it does. Um, but I also think that, social anxiety has been with us for an awfully long time.
Yeah.
And I think that the teenage years are particularly difficult years to navigate for a lot of kids, regardless of social media.
Yeah. Last time we spoke, you mentioned the importance of listening to someone as a really critical skill. As important as telling stories is learning how to listen to a story. I appreciate when our kids have an opportunity to be with their friends in person, and there has to be that kind of give and take rather than the interaction with the screen, where you may be telling a story to someone, but you're in the driver's seat the entire time, and you're not needing to give space for the other person to have a part of that story or to reflect back or to, have a part in the conversation.
So, one of the things about family storytelling that we've found to be really, really important, particularly when families are kind of collaboratively talking about an experience they've had together, is a notion of validation. And I think you used this word earlier in this conversation. Families that are really listening to each other and validating each other's perspective, even if they don't share that perspective, have kids who are doing better. Families where, okay, you take your turn, you tell your part of the story. Now it's my turn, I'll tell my part of the story. Now it's mom's turn, she'll tell her part of the story. Those kids are not doing as well as the families in which the turn taking is more collaborative. Essentially marking, I hear what you're saying. I understand your perspective, even if I don't share it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's even better if I do share it. It's like, yes, it really was sad and awful. But even if we don't share that perspective, I also want to say something about challenging stories,
Mm.
negative stories,
Hmm.
stories about fights or about loss. Loss is a particularly interesting kind of story to tell because with loss, there is no happy ending. The loss just is.
Hmm.
And being able to sit with that is hard for people. I think, particularly in American culture, we don't know how to sit with loss and
Hmm.
just accept it. And families that are able to validate each other's sense of loss over perhaps a grandparent who died or a beloved pet, those families who are able to openly talk about this, who are able to sit with that kind of loss and acknowledge it, have kids who are doing better on a whole host of mental health measures. But what's also important to know is that even within that loss, we will persevere as a family. We will get through it. It will be hard. There isn't going to be, you know, bright sunshine, that make everything okay. But we also have joyous experiences as
Hmm.
well as sad experiences. My colleague Marshall Duke calls this an oscillating narrative. So
Mm.
it's not everything is always good, not everything is always bad. We have both tears and joy in life, and we share that as a family.
Yeah. And so not being afraid to have those conversations or share those experiences, either as a shared family narrative or as your own, and
Yes.
an intergenerational narrative, I guess it would be. Yeah, that those are very important stories to share with kids, and as you just said, they get a lot of benefit from that.
Yes. Having said that, I think there are some kinds of family stories, intergenerational stories, that may really be dark and traumatic. And how and when you share those kinds of stories becomes a little bit more difficult. I think it's important to acknowledge that you have to be developmentally appropriate. There are certain stories we don't tell very young children, but children are aware when their parents or their grandparents or their older siblings, their families, they're aware when there are secrets. I mean, we have adolescents who say, I don't know much about it. I know something bad happened. My mom won't talk. That is not a good resolution either. So you have to kind of figure out how and when to talk about some of these really dark or more challenging histories.
Are there tools or resources you can point to, Robyn, for helping people who may need to think about how to do that mindfully,
I do
thoughtfully?
think there are, I mean, I am not a clinician. There are mental health professionals, and now you can do teletherapy. I think in these kinds of situations, if you are struggling with this, I think absolutely there are family counselors and mental health facilitators who can help you individually and as a family talk about these kinds of things. And I don't think we should shy away from using those resources.
Taking a little bit of a step back, so not the really traumatic kinds of stories, but just stories of loss and enduring these difficult, everyday, difficult situations. Have you seen over time a tendency for families to maybe not tell those stories? Like, has an avoidance of those stories become more common over time? Is that anything that you have looked at or can speak to? I'm thinking I've read some books. I'm thinking about Jonathan Haidt's book, most recently, Anxious Generation, talking about how there's been sort of a releasing of constraints for kids spending time in the online world and a tightening of how we let our kids be out in the real world. And where generations ago people used to maybe walk to the corner store or be able to play in a way that now we're worried about what's happening out in the real world. I guess we could debate whether that is actually happening or not. But it would seem like if that is the case, there may be this increased protection that we're wanting to give to kids, even just in the stories that we tell them, and not wanting to expose them to these kind of difficult challenges or, challenging stories.
I do think there's a tendency in today's kind of parenting environment to think that you have to make everything positive and perfect for your child. And I think that that is going to backfire because life is not all positive and all perfect. And kids who grow up understanding that there are going to be challenges, but that they will have the resources to meet those challenges, do better than kids who don't understand that there are going to be challenges. So that's a very broad way of saying, I think one of the ways that we help children understand that there are going to be challenges and how do we deal with them is through these intergenerational narratives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is exactly what the adolescents are telling us, that they are learning lessons about how to navigate the world from the stories that their parents are telling them about their own childhood. I mean, I think because we work with young teenagers in a lot of our work, a lot of the stories, the intergenerational narratives are about being bullied. And what if you have no resources to deal with bullies versus knowing how your mom dealt with bullies?
Yeah.
And having some strategies for that. That's a small challenge in some ways, but those become bigger challenges as you get older.
Yeah.
If you don't learn to deal with those small challenges, how are you going to deal with the big challenges?
Yeah.
I want to go back to what you asked me about parents being anxious about this. How can I tell better stories? I do think being a little bit mindful about it, but don't sweat it. I mean, seriously, we tape record family interactions. We tape record family dinners. We have yet to encounter a family that doesn't tell stories. I mean, it just doesn't happen. Some families tell more stories. They tell more elaborated stories. They tell stories that maybe are a little bit more resourceful in talking about how people thought and felt and resolved issues, that's all good.
Hmm.
And, yes, be mindful about that. But we're all storytellers. Stories account for 40% of human conversation.
That's crazy.
We tell stories.
Yeah.
And once you start thinking about it, you start to realize, even in this conversation we've shared stories about our lives.
Yes.
We can't interact with another human being without telling stories. So relax into it.
Yeah.
It's happening.
Worry about something else, not this. Yeah, I found that piece of our first conversation very reassuring. This isn't something that you need to be concerned you are not going to do.
And the one thing you don't want to do is say, oh my goodness, I have to tell my adolescent stories. So sit down,
Yeah.
just sit there and listen to me, and I'm going to tell you these stories about when I was in high school. That is not going to work.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, don't even go there. So really, just stories will come up when and as your kids need them. They're going to be. And I also think the other side of that is the listening, that it's not always parents telling kids stories.
Mm,
It's the kids telling their parents stories
yes.
and listening to the stories that your kids are telling you.
Yes.
Kind of thinking, why is she telling me this story? What's going on here?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, so important, if for no other reason than you said earlier, to validate them. Yeah. And figure out how to be able to help them through that. But it sounded to me like validation is a key piece of that.
Validation is a key piece, even if you want to turn them off of that, pivot off of. If you think that your child is reacting in a way that's not healthy or
Mm,
helpful, you need to first understand and validate their feelings before you can pivot them around
yeah.
to a different way of understanding it.
And is that true? I imagine so, but is that true regardless of what the content of that story or the topic or the issue that they're stuck on?
Probably.
Okay.
I would say
The answer can be it depends. I know that
the
is often.
majority of the time I think that's true. I would imagine there are some cases where you have to just say, no, that is not okay.
Yeah, of course. And I don't mean true traumas or I am going to harm myself kind of behavior. Yeah. Okay. Robyn, if anybody wanted to follow your writing, I will link to all of these resources in our show notes, but you have your website and your blog.
My blog is the best way to follow me in terms of, learning more about the work that we do on family stories, but also linking to other things that are happening in the research world around storytelling and the importance of stories.
Great. Oh, are there any books you're reading for fun these days that you have really been enjoying?
I read a lot of memoirs
Okay.
because I find them fascinating. And I'll give a plug. One of my good friends just published a fascinating memoir. Her name is Cynthia Blakely, and she
Yes.
published a memoir called The Innermost House about growing up on Cape Cod. And what's really interesting about her memoir, she had a very, very challenging, difficult childhood. In many ways, a very, very loving but difficult mother. But in her memoir, she goes back and tells her mother's story and her grandmother's story and
Oh,
how it links to this kind of intergenerational transmission of understanding life that is just beautifully written.
love that.
And
Cynthia Blakely.
yes,
All right. We'll put in a plug for that.
and read it. You'll love it.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for that. This was fascinating. And both of these conversations I have enjoyed so much. So thank you for taking the time and for
Thank
all of the
you.
research that you do and for finding ways to share this with the world as you continue to do. Like I said, I really, as I listen to my kids since our last conversation, I am thinking about what you shared with me at our first call. And so if nothing else comes out of this, you have helped me think differently about how we're engaging with our kids. And I really appreciate that. So thank you for sharing that with the world.
Yeah. Well, you're very welcome. My feeling is that, and I will say this, science has been under attack in the last few months. And I think it's important that people understand that science is about helping individuals create better lives for themselves and their families. And if we don't support science, then we're not supporting families and communities.
Yes, completely agree. Thank you for saying that out loud. I appreciate it. I concur.
Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. All right.
Okay. Thanks so much, Kiyah.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for hanging out with me on The Weekly Parent. If something you heard today made you think, laugh, or feel just a little more human, don't be shy. Subscribe, text it to your BFF or group chat, or leave us a review. Remember, you'll find free tools, downloads, and whatever else I've cooked up this week in the show notes. Check those out. Parenting is messy. Let's not do it alone. See you next time.